Hello and welcome back to this, the 11th and final episode of the Japan Memo podcast for this year. Japan Memo, of course, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. In this series, we bring together experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're pleased to welcome two wonderful guests and indeed two fellow Japan chairs, Dr. Kristi Govella and Dr. Eva Pejsova, to take a look back over what has been a really turbulent 2025 for the world but also for Japan, and particularly close look at the key moments of Japan's security and diplomacy over the year. Before we dive into the discussion, let me briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Kristi Govella is Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in the US, and serves as the co-editor of the journal Asia Policy. Kristi is also Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and International Relations at the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies at the University of Oxford. She specializes in the intersection of economics, security and governance, with a particular focus on the Indo-Pacific region and Japan. She has previously held positions at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Harvard University, and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Welcome, Kristi.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Dr. Eva Pejsova holds the Japan Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, of the Brussels School of Governance. Until 2019, Eva was in charge of the Asia portfolio at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, the EU's official agency for foreign and security policy research and analysis. She obtained her PhD in strategic studies from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, in Singapore, and has previously worked with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the French Prime Minister's Office, the OECD, and the Asia-Europe Foundation. Eva regularly lectures at Sciences Po Paris, the Geneva Centre for Security Studies, and also briefs the members of the European Parliament. Her research focuses on Indo-Pacific security dynamics, notably in the field of maritime security, Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, EU-Japan relations, and Japan's foreign and security policy. A warm welcome to you too, Eva.
Thanks, Robert. Great to be here.
Kristi and Eva, thank you both very much for joining us to cast our eyes over what has been quite a year for Japan. If we start by looking back at the Ishiba administration in 2025, Ishiba Shigeru began his term as Prime Minister in October 2024. He fought two national elections, one for the lower house shortly after taking office and one for the upper house in July 2025 this year, with his ruling Liberal Democratic Party faring badly in each election, and he announced his resignation in September this year. There's quite a lot of turbulence in the political, economic and security domains in Japan. Let's start with the economic issues that Japan's experienced this year. The return of Donald Trump to the White House and then President Trump's imposition of heavy tariffs on Liberation Day, what he called Liberation Day, in April was one such challenge for Japan. And Japan, I think, incurred an initial tariff of around 24%, which put its strategically important automotive sector at quite a lot of peril. Kristi, open with a question to you on tariffs and Japan. How do you think the Ishiba administration tackled this, and how does that set Japan up for economic relations with the US going forward?
It certainly has been quite a year. Since the start of the second Trump administration, U.S. tariffs have definitely posed perhaps the greatest challenge to Japan in its foreign policy. In March, actually, before Liberation Day, the U.S. announced 25% tariffs on autos and auto parts, which affected a Japanese industry that constitutes about 22% of its total exports and employs maybe 8% of its workforce. So that was a very big concern for Japan. And then, as you mentioned, Japan was eventually slapped with potentially 25% reciprocal tariffs separately. So in combination, this was going to have a potentially significant impact on Japan's GDP and its economic growth. So consequently, we saw the Ishiba administration prioritize these tariff negotiations, and Chief Negotiator Akazawa was in Washington basically every week, eventually leading to the July announcement of a trade deal that promised the U.S. up to $550 billion in Japanese investment and improved market access, or actually mostly purchasing of U.S. goods for U.S. producers, while also providing Japan with some relief in the form of reduced 15% reciprocal and auto tariffs. And then there was still a lot of ambiguity in that announcement, so they released another set of documents in September that clarified some of the terms of investment and actually implemented the tariff reductions, which were not done immediately. So if we look at the situation now, it's clear that it's really still evolving. The US has been negotiating with other countries constantly, and so now it's all about where countries stand relative to one another in terms of these tariff rates. And of course, the Trump administration is still imposing new sectoral tariffs and announcing exemptions. It's quite a fluid situation. If you look at some of the estimates of relative tariff advantages compared to competitor countries, Japan seems to fall somewhere in the middle overall. But actually, if you look kind of product by product, sector by sector, it's much more complicated. And so the impacts are really not uniformly spread. Moreover, I think we're really just at the beginning of the process, because if we think about the implementation of the trade deal, we're just starting to learn more about how this might move forward. And it's clear that's going to be a constant process of negotiation and discussion over the next 3 years. So we have a process laid out for the investments, which essentially will be selected through a process involving an investment committee of U.S. representatives that will then consult with another committee made up of U.S. and Japan representatives. And then they'll make recommendations to the president, who will play a role in the whole decision-making process. And then approved investments will essentially be presented to Japan for review, and they have to provide funding within 45 days, or they could refuse, but then that would carry the risk that the US could increase tariffs. So we have this kind of, very involved political process, but we're only now seeing some of the potential deals that could happen under this agreement. The Japanese side has been trying to take a proactive role in proposing ideas. And during President Trump's recent visit to Japan, there was a list of over 20 companies that was presented, including big names like SoftBank, et cetera. But it's still early in the process. And, when we think about the fact that it's $550 billion in promised investment that is supposed to be materialized by the last day of Trump's term, which is January 19, 2029, it's a pretty tall order. So it's likely that these tariff negotiations are really the beginning of an ongoing process that we're going to hear more about for the next 3 years.
Thank you for that. A lot of detail in what you've just said. I was struck by your point, Kristi, about this being the beginning of the process, and obviously to 2029, there's a sort of long time to go. Presumably, from what you're saying, you're suggesting this is going to suck quite a lot of bandwidth out of the Takaichi administration, assuming obviously that this administration lasts politically and in terms of policy making.
Yes, I think it will absorb attention. It's likely that, as with past experiences with the Trump administration, there will be an ebb and flow to this. So, at various times, we'll probably turn our attention to security and burden sharing, and then trade and investment will probably come back up. But we know that tariffs and trade are a high priority for President Trump. Really, the US-Japan agreement presents perhaps one of his most substantial success opportunities, so he's likely to lean on that for optics and to demonstrate that his policies are bearing fruit. But we're sure to hear more about it.
Turning now to security, which is the other sort of pillar of Japan's relations with the US. Prime Minister Ishiba's administration also sought to maintain the momentum that's been gathering in Japan's changing security posture over the past few years, even though his signature idea of Asian NATO, of course, failed to make any progress. But one highlight during his premiership and for Japan's defense industry was Japan's successful bid to supply Australia with the Mogami class frigates, which was announced in August. So, Eva, taking this in the round, how do you view the progress or otherwise of Ishiba's administration in the security domain?
Thanks, Robert. I think actually Prime Minister Ishiba did pretty well as Prime Minister when it comes to security defense. He was a bit unlucky with the domestic electoral cycles, let's say. But as you said, and when it comes to security defense policy, there is really a great deal of continuity that we are seeing since Abe. There's this progressive shift towards a more proactive role that Abe started that was carried forward by Kishida and then Ishiba. And under Ishiba's administration, I think we're really evolving towards a more independent defense posture. You alluded or mentioned this concept of one theater that Gen Nakatani, the defense minister, mentioned during his meeting with Secretary Hexat in March in Japan, which was taking into account Japan's role in this potential regional contingency and taking into account the Korean and East China Sea and the South China Sea in a single theater perspective. And it was also General Nakatani, by the way, that mentioned for the first time in the context of Japan this notion or term of strategic autonomy at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore earlier this year. Now, of course, we can speculate what it means to talk about autonomy in Japan's context, but essentially, it is all about making Japan a more capable, more ready, a more useful, more worthy ally within the US-Japan alliance, including in a regional contingency. So Japan to play and is expected to play, to be in the front line of any sort of potential crisis. So when we talk about the US-Japan alliance or dynamic, another major achievement was the establishment of the Joint Operational Command in Japan, which allows greater coordination between the self-defense forces and the US forces on Japan's soil. A lot of achievements, a lot of continuity. The defense industrial cooperation side is absolutely key. I'm glad you mentioned the Mogami-class frigates deal with Australia. In defense industrial cooperation, as we see, is really the new form of deterrence architecture that is building up in the Indo-Pacific. And Japan has been slightly lagging behind in that respect. So it's great news for Japan that started. Now, the important thing is, of course, to get it right. It needs to deliver. It's going to be a test case and a detrimental for Japan's reputation as a defense industrial actor and provider in the future.
You didn't pick up my invitation to talk about Asian NATO.
There was so much talk about this, and I thought it was a little bit unfair to Ishiba when the whole talk started. We know it was mostly a kind of a personal commentary that was, not an official statement. We know that there has been talks about stepping up, formalizing relationships in the region for many years. And Japan has been quite active in that front for decades, really. But it hasn't come to much. We know the limitations. So I kind of try to dissociate it from Ishiba's former role as a prime minister, if that's okay, because I thought it was so much covered and there was so much buzz around it. I didn't want to delve too much about it.
Absolutely fair enough. Moving from Ishiba-san to the new government led by Takaichi Sanae, after Prime Minister Ishiba announced his resignation in September, Takaichi-san won the LDP's leadership election. For those of us that follow Japanese politics very closely, this was incredibly exciting. For the LDP and Komeito, less exciting, but immediately after she won the leadership election, the LDP's quarter-century cooperation with Komeito collapsed, which forced the LDP to seek a new coalition partner, which it managed to do at the last minute in the form of a party on the right of the political spectrum, Ishin no Kai, Japan Innovation Party in English. As a result of all this, Takaichi took office in late October. I thought she was pretty quick in moving with setting her policy agenda. And it's quite clear that even though Takaichi-san's government is in its early stages, it really does have a very different flavour from Ishiba's administration, from Kishida's, and of course from Suga's administration too. So it does feel quite a sort of fresh administration. With the new cabinet, what messages do you think that she's trying to send in terms of policy priorities? Kristi?
Well, if we think about the fact that the LDP presidential election was the subject of a lot of discussion and internal contestation in the LDP, one of the key messages of the cabinet really is clear. It's about LDP unity and bringing together these different factions. So she has brought in Hayashi, she's brought in Koizumi, for example, who were her main rivals. We see that particularly in some areas, she's brought in some really strong leaders too, who are expected to shake things up. So a lot of people in the business world have been focused on Katayama as Ministry of Finance leader, as a former finance bureaucrat, with somebody who has perhaps strong views on foreign exchange rates and things like that. Koizumi is somebody who's been around and trying to make a name for himself, but he's also known to have great interest in defense issues. And so people are very excited about what he may do there. We see both the internal message of trying to bring together an LDP that has been, increasingly divided between its conservative and liberal factions, and then also trying to put together a cabinet that has the leadership ability to really move forward and navigate Japan. You also see some elements of continuity with the Ishiba administration, for example, keeping Akazawa in terms of having a role in tariff negotiations to kind of ease the way. So I think there were a lot of smart choices. And compared to the Ishiba administration, which was criticized for kind of keeping out the rivals, et cetera, this is one that I think is a little more sensitive to the political dynamics now. And they are difficult to navigate, but at least it's a good initial start.
As Kristi, you just said, Akazawa-san at METI being so critical for the tariff negotiations, that gives some continuity for Japan, to your point about this being the sort of beginning of a process of negotiations on tariffs and trade and investment and so on. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Moving to what seems to be one of the sort of core focuses of the Takaichi administration, defense again. In October 2025, there was a US-Japan defense ministerial meeting, which was held in Tokyo, where US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Japan's new defense minister Koizumi Shinjiro, they agreed to further enhance the US-Japan security alliance, given the tensions that are going on in the Indo-Pacific. This was an important meeting. And US and Japan also pledged to further develop cooperation with Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, and so on for the stability of the Indo-Pacific. Kristi, again, how do you view the development of security cooperation between Japan, the US, and other key partners in the Indo-Pacific under Takaichi's new administration?
To build on Ava's comments, I largely agree that we've seen much more continuity in terms of security compared to economics. And so Takaichi is building on a relationship that's been in development for a long time. And it was really striking, actually, that we did not see a lot of rhetorical change out of the second Trump administration in security from an administration that is not shy about shaking things up in basically every policy area with every partner. We've seen, for example, that there have been renewed commitments or renewed statements about the importance of upgrading U.S. Forces Japan and implementing the Japan Self-Defense Forces Joint Operations Command. We've seen that Takaichi has reiterated her commitment to increasing Japan's defense spending to 2% of GDP and actually has accelerated that and has committed to doing that by next year instead of 2 years later. So that's a big commitment. We've seen her say that she is going to revise the 3 key national security documents, for example. So all of these things build on the foundation that was there, but they're also clearly anticipating the demands that are expected to come from the U.S. on burden sharing and increased defense spending after Takaichi came into office, and particularly after her meeting with Trump and Hegseth's meeting with Koizumi. There is a bit more momentum. Before that, of course, there had been incidents like the canceling of the 2+2 meeting between the U.S. and Japan. There were a number of unusually critical statements about the U.S. from key politicians, et cetera, just saying that they didn't feel like the U.S. was treating a key ally very well. There have been tensions, and there are concerns about the general direction of U.S. foreign policy and the credibility of extended deterrence, et cetera. Japan's key priority in security is to maintain and strengthen the US-Japan alliance because that is the foundation of their military security. But as Eva already said, it's been on a trajectory of strengthening partnerships with other regional countries as well. You talked a little bit about Australia. Aside from the Mogami deal, of course, Japan and Australia, they have a reciprocal access agreement, and they've been building cooperation based on that. They, at their recent 2+2, announced closer cooperation plans in economic security, advanced capabilities, et cetera. We also see increasing cooperation between Japan and the Philippines, which also have started talks on information security agreements and acquisition agreements. And they're also building on their own reciprocal access agreement, which they just entered into force in September, I believe. We see these steps happening. And also with South Korea, we saw this wave of really intensive cooperation under Biden, Kishida, and Yoon that began a couple of years ago, particularly culminating in the Camp David summit. And although there has been a lot of concern about where this stands now that leadership has changed in all 3 countries, we do see Japan under new leadership trying to maintain that connection with Korea. Japan is maintaining all of those Indo-Pacific relationships. And if anything, I think the Trump administration has perhaps reinvigorated or re-energized that search for cooperation. And Eva talked a bit about the Europe side, so I won't focus on that. But you clearly see Japan following this dual approach of trying to really strengthen security and economics with the U.S., but then also building out with these like-minded regional partners.
Well, to continue on Europe, and Eva, you mentioned the Shangri-La dialogue. It's reminded me that this year, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, this has been the case, but we've seen increasing representation at the Shangri-La dialogue from European countries, I think reflecting their growing interest in security in the Indo-Pacific, the fact that the security theatres of Europe and Asia are sort of tied together. And we see that with North Korean troops fighting in Russia's war against Ukraine, quite an astonishing development in so many ways. In other sort of Japan-Europe developments, we also saw the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte visiting Japan quite recently, pushing European engagement with Japan on matters of international security. And then we have, of course, the acceleration, deepening of defence industrial relations, for example, with the UK, Italy, Japan Global Combat Air Programme, GCAP. So, Eva, given all of these things, how do you think the Takaichi administration is going to deal with EU-Japan defence and security relations in the coming year?
There's a lot happening on the Europe-Japan front. It's been keeping us very busy over the last 5 years. We keep referring to the golden age of Europe-Japan relations, actually since, 2019. It rings a bell with the new golden age in the US-Japan alliance. As you both referred to, I mean, there's really an unprecedented level of strategic alignment between the two, even more now than, frankly, a year ago. Kristi already alluded to it. It's not just the Russia-China connection, but now the North Korea, Russia-China alignment. It is what you said, Robert, about this interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific security theaters, which is really shared by both Europeans and Japan, and slightly less signaled or more ambiguously signaled from Washington these days. But frankly, the cooperation between the two is also seen as a hedging strategy against the US unpredictability, or at least the unpredictability of the current US government. The interest is there on both sides. Europe needs partners it can trust, right? Be it on the economic security side, new technology, security defense itself, to build up its competitiveness. And Japan is the most like-minded of them all. And the same goes for Japan. Kristi also mentioned that this diversification strategy, which again was started already since Abe, is there. We hear about, Chris Hughes calls it the bilateralism plus. Now we heard about a plan A plus, right? So plan B doesn't exist, but there's plan A, which is the US, and then there's the plus. That Europe definitely goes into that, and we see it across the spectrum. So when you talk about Europe, and I don't want to go into too much details, but of course you have the EU, you have the member states, and you have NATO. On all levels, there are quite significant developments. On the member states, you mentioned the reciprocal access agreement with Australia, but there's the one with the UK. There's one being negotiated with France with ups and downs. It's still not concluded. On the EU level, the political foundation is there. We have the Strategic Partnership Agreement since 2019, the Economic Partnership Agreement, and the newest kid on the block has been the Security Defense Partnership, which is concluded at the end of 2024. We need to be quite realistic. There's limits what you can do with the EU as a security actor. But since we're talking about security, the focus now is mostly on dual use, emerging disruptive technologies, which is the sort of lower hanging fruit. Now with Japan being part of this instrument, it has access to Horizon Europe project, which is this research and innovation project that we expect this big bulk of money now coming in precisely on those projects. So let's see what will happen. But there's ongoing also work on quantum, HPC, secure communications, and a lot of work on space. So all these a little bit, niche areas, at least on the EU level. Well, the European Space Agency recently opened its office in Tokyo. So we won't have a NATO office, but you have a European Space Agency in Tokyo. A lot of progress on the NATO side. We now have an ambassador, a Japanese mission in Brussels to NATO, which has been extremely active and ongoing work on the NATO side of things. And as you mentioned, the defense industrial cooperation is again key. So Europeans realize how it's important. I mean, we need it for ourselves, but we also realize it's one of the best contributions we can do for the Indo-Pacific security. GCAP is, of course, the key landmark examples. We need to really think how to expand and deepen cooperations like that. We could think of a GCAP Pillar 2. There has been a lot of conversations of how we can expand this, build on this dynamic, and of course, invest in new ones. Endless possibilities, a lot of political interest and gradual progress, I would say. It's a work in progress. So I'm quite confident that this will continue in the coming years.
As a coda to your comments there, Eva, you mentioned earlier, which struck me, as defence industrial cooperation as a new form of deterrence. You mentioned GCAP, of course, which is sort of jewel in the crown, if you like, of that. How does Prime Minister Takaichi, Japan, manage this increasing cooperation with EU, UK, NATO, at the same time as the US is becoming more assertive in its demand that its alliance partners buy from the US and so on. Of course, Japan's sort of stuck in quite a difficult position given that the US is its only alliance partner. You said you were confident, which is nice, about the future. Are you confident that Japan can manage these conflicting things?
Well, we've been asked to buy more American as well. So we're kind of in slightly, similar boat, although not to the same extent and with same vulnerabilities. We're quite aware that, of course, the big deals and the big bulk will probably have to be invested into the US. On the other hand, what I find quite encouraging, the US has been supportive of the Mogami deal, for instance, with Australia. Anything that can lift the burden off the US shoulders is encouraged by the current administration. So we need to be realistic. The big bulk of defense investments will probably be directed on both sides, by the way, to the US. But that's why I also mentioned these niche areas. There is quite a lot, especially when it comes to new technologies, that can be done and will be probably done outside of the strictly bilateral US framework. And this is the ones that have been focusing, especially in terms of digital connectivity and these sort of things.
UK and Japan had their 2+2 meeting earlier this year. And I was struck by the complementarity between the UK and Japan in so many ways, but also the activity that's going on around areas like quantum and AI. There's quite a lot of activity in areas perhaps less well covered in the press. Thinking about the other really important piece of the jigsaw for Japan, and that, of course, is China, critical economic partner for Japan, but also an increasing threat in many areas. Competition over key technologies and resources is becoming increasingly fraught. China's been imposing greater restrictions on its own strategic areas that it has strategic advantage, such as rare earth materials and magnets, the restrictions that were put in October this year. And Japan and the US have recently responded with their joint framework for mining and processing rare earths and critical materials, minerals, which seems to be part of a sort of broader US push to conclude deals with those countries that can help it secure supply chains in this area. Kristi, economic security, critical for Japan. How do you think Japan's economic security cooperation will be developed by the Takaichi administration?
Economic security became a major area of cooperation with Japan under the Biden administration, and that seems very likely to continue. Some of that's related to the concerns about China that you mentioned, as well as, the context of disruptions from the pandemic, disruptions from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all of the, activities and impacts on supply chains or energy, et cetera. There are a lot of reasons that economic security makes sense for Japan as a policy focus. And when we think about the current economic nationalism rising in the US and other places, it also makes sense because economic security remains a way through which the US and Japan, for example, can still cooperate and justify this strategically and politically. We saw that a bit under the Biden administration, which also had its own type of economic nationalism embedded in it, but we see this even more under the second Trump administration. When we consider Takaichi herself, she was economic security minister, and therefore she has strengths in this area, in addition to her well-known focus on traditional security and defense. Domestically, we've already seen that she's called for an update to Japan's domestic economic security legislation. And the first big policy package that she proposed recently, her financial package, actually includes investment in a number of key industries such as AI, semiconductors, shipbuilding, et cetera, that also relate to economic security. So domestically, we see movement. US and Japan, if we think about the $550 billion in strategic investment that's supposed to flow from Japan to the US, we also see economic security as a big theme. Some of the sectors that have been flagged are things like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, shipbuilding, energy, AI, quantum, etc. When Trump visited, we heard more about this. We saw the two countries put forward a technology prosperity agreement that also talked about research security, open RAN and beyond 5G, 6G tech, etc. Many of the same sectors I mentioned in the trade agreement. And then there was also a critical minerals agreement that they put forward that basically tried to set up a framework for the US and Japan to identify and eventually finance projects that span the entire supply chain for critical minerals, from mining all the way to derivative products like batteries. We see still a lot of cooperation happening in between, for example, the US and Japan, even though there are these tensions over the tariffs. And of course, as we've been talking about, Japan is also pursuing economic security cooperation with a wide variety of other partners in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, with the UK and their new economic 2+2 that they have launched. There looks to be opportunity for Japan to kind of simultaneously pursue cooperation with the US and others, as we've been talking about. But it also seems like, for example, we already see the Trump administration's diplomacy evolving. If we take critical minerals, for example, the Trump administration has been incredibly active negotiating bilateral critical minerals agreements with all kinds of countries, despite the fact that they already have a multilateral mineral securities partnership that they could use. We see them already starting to broaden out this bilateral cooperation and in some cases, like even trilateralize it. You see signs of this with the US, Japan, Australia, for example. So I think that economic security is going to be an active area, but in some ways we might see these fluctuations between bilateral and minilateral and kind of a little bit of confusion, but still moving forward together on many fronts.
While we're on China, even if it's tangentially, I have to ask you about the current state of Japan-China relations, which following Prime Minister Takaichi's comments in Budget Committee it was around Taiwan and how the impact a kinetic attack on Taiwan by China would have on Japan. Do you have any thoughts about this whole situation that's kicked off that was triggered by that?
There's been so much noise about this newest spat. I mean, I think all the audience is quite familiar about how it started. The topic itself is, of course, not new. The fact that such a contingency would have, or a direct effect on Japanese security is a fact. The fact that it may then involve or trigger an engagement along the collective security defense with the United States, it seems like a no-brainer to anyone who follows. And the fact that, of course, that it was voiced out in the Diet, in the parliament, is what makes the difference. But I think all of us who watch Japan and therefore also China-Japan relations over the past 20 years or even before, we've seen that there's continuity in that sense. Of course, China is always using such occasions to bring all the historical legacies, to reiterate its messages. I mean, this time was no exception. It's been quite violent, but hardly surprising. To me, it speaks more about the kind of uncertainties in China. I mean, if you really need to spread the message so much, including by calling President Trump and to reiterate, etc., it also sends a message on its own. I'm quite, again, confident. Maybe I'm just too optimistic, perhaps because we've seen similar outbursts in the past. And the one that actually comes to my mind is the 2012 spat over the Senkaku Diaoyu nationalization by the Japanese government that triggered 2 years of almost silence at the summit level, right? And eventually we managed to get over. So in that sense, I'm sure that the current Takaichi government and Takaichi herself is very aware that it needs to be solved out and will put her aides to pave the way to eventually meet at the next APEC summit. I mean, there's been some talk about that. And at the same time, what's rather encouraging, actually, is that her popularity rating at home have not plummeted drastically at all. In fact, it's still over 70%, even just a few days after the scandals erupted. So apart from, yes, the opposition and some of the more or less assertive, less hawkish voices in Japan being quite critical about this, overall, her popularity has not been affected. I'm not saying it's all good, but what is interesting, I mean, the whole Taiwan dynamic is fascinating in the triangle between China, Japan, and the US, of course. And that would be for another podcast episode. But that is fascinating to see the reaction. I mean, whether the United States or there is a genuine concern also in Japan over the US commitment over Taiwan, and some of the silences around this topic have been interpreted in various ways. Now, we don't question the importance of Taiwan to U.S. security and posturing in the Indo-Pacific. That's the fact. But of course, I mean, it falls also under this perceived unpredictability of the U.S. government by Japan. So it's on the table. Now, the good news is Japan has said what it's been said behind the curtains for a long time. And China deals with it. And I'm sure that China and Japan will solve the situation in due time.
Looking ahead now, it's 2026, thinking about broader foreign policy stance of the Takaichi administration. Takaichi-san obviously had a very close political relationship with the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. That stood her in good stead for her meeting with President Trump in October, of course. When we're thinking about how Takaichi's foreign policy stance is going to evolve over the next year or so, do you see that there may be sort of shades of Abeism, if there is such a thing, in Takaichi's foreign policy? I mean, perhaps she will retool or change the free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP vision, for example. Give us your thoughts on 2026 in foreign policy terms.
There's so much talk about the Abe legacy in Takaichi's acting, be it with the US or elsewhere. But I'm actually glad that you brought up the FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept, because I'm a big fan, and Kristi knows. There is a lot of continuity, but the security context has evolved. We know that. And it's much more dangerous. It's much more severe for Japan now than it was under Abe. So of course it will need to adapt. But since you mentioned the FOIP, I think it's really interesting to actually question what it is about. Yes, primarily it is a connectivity strategy that kind of builds up on Japan's commitment to development assistance. And it was a very clever way to promote Japan's security interest in the region and beyond. But I also see it as a concept that really managed to propose Japan as a regional or even global leader when it comes to the promotion of this ocean of openness, freedom, and rules-based order. And that is perhaps more needed in the region today than it was before. And it was something that was supported by the Biden administration that we don't hear that much from the White House these days. But it's really the role of Japan as a regional and global. So now we see somehow Japan getting a little bit onwards and really focusing on its defense and the US alliance and a little bit just on the security side. But we see much less talk about Japan as a global actor or regional actor, and that really is underpinned by this rules-based order promotion. I personally think it should not drop the ball on FOIP because there is a window of opportunity. There's a bit of a vacuum actually for this role more than ever. I would imagine that it's going to be more injected with security, which is fine, just to give it a little bit more security flavor, which it already has. Initiatives like the official security assistance may take up a little bit more. We already see it with the meeting with ASEAN. Around Southeast Asia, a lot of countries are really sympathetic to Japan's problems and are eager to build up their military. So Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, more are to come. FOIP could be used also to continue engage with those countries, inject a little bit more security, while, of course, as we said, the US alliance and the strengthening of relationship with Philippines, Australia, but also India in some respects will be key. And that's something that Abe started. Definitely continuity with a bit more security.
Looking at the future is difficult. Given that you both know Japan so well, I'd be really interested in hearing from each of you what you think the highlights in 2026 of Takaichi's administration will be. One of the things that struck me as quite unusual, actually, was the coalition document with Ishin, which was actually almost like a manifesto by Japanese political standards. It was pretty detailed on all sorts of areas, such as revising the three national security documents by the end of the year, intelligence reforms, and so on. So those are the things that I'll be looking out for. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what you think will be important to watch for in 2026. Kristi, if I could start with you.
I think there are a lot of individual policies that we could talk about, like the national security documents, defense spending, economic security, I've all mentioned. But I think that two things that I'll be watching because I think they're incredibly important for Takaichi to cement her stability and to lay a foundation to move forward will be first, how she handles her domestic political situation with her coalition, and then second, I think the Japanese economy. So just to start on the political situation, Robert, you already alluded to it, but the LDP is in a pretty weak situation in a very fluid political environment. So they have a very fresh coalition with Isshin no Kai after their 26-year-old coalition with Komeito broke up. The coalition partners are still feeling things out. There are a lot of policy compromises that they've discussed, but they're still figuring out how to be a coalition and to stay on the same page. It was a huge win for the LDP that several independent policymakers have decided to join them in the lower house now. So they now have a slim majority in the lower house, which means that they can pass budget bills and things without opposition parties. So that's a huge win for the LDP and its new coalition. But it's still a pretty fragile alliance. It's really just another sign, really, that these independents across the line that the political situation is really fluid and things could change at any moment. So Takaichi needs to figure out that political side of the coalition and then also look ahead to the next potential election and figure out if Ishinokai and the LDP can actually coordinate. They don't have another election required in the near future, but people are consistently talking about snap elections that could occur, could become necessary. So this is really the political foundation of the Takaichi administration and the LDP that needs to be considered, and you can expect that she'll try to make moves on this. The second part is the economy, because it's very clear that the voters sent a message to the LDP that they're unhappy with inflation, high prices. So we see Takaichi trying to address voters' concerns while also trying to balance that with considering the long-term health of the economy and not exacerbating the weak yen. And that's really a tough balance to get. So she has this slogan of responsible and proactive fiscal policy that she's going with right now, which I think tells us about some of these tensions. And actually, her first major policy as prime minister was approving I think it was around 21 trillion yen economic stimulus package. And so if we look at that, we see this tension. We see, a combination of cash handouts, grants to local governments, financial support to households to cover things like utility bills, which is part of that trying to make the Japanese people feel like it's easier to meet these expenses and show some kind of effect in the short term. And then also trying to balance that with investing in key industries, as I mentioned before, like AI, semiconductors, et cetera. So she's trying to do that. But, the way economics work, it's possible that this kind of fiscal stimulus will exacerbate the inflation problem, will weaken the yen further. I think we'll see her continually try to fine-tune this balance to get that political plus economic formula right, and working with her key cabinet ministers to do so.
On the election, potential snap election, I mean, she is herself very popular. I mean, the ratings are quite stratospheric. To try to sort of tease a forecast out of you, do you think this will persuade her to go to the country in 2026?
Takaichi's support ratings are phenomenally high at the moment. I think they're the second highest of any prime minister directly after being elected. And the other one, I believe, was Hatoyama with the DPJ, when people were just excited about change of government after so long. So people are definitely riding high on this idea of change. And I think she's had a really strong start. But then if we look at the support ratings for the LDP, those are still fairly low. We always expect with elections that a popular prime minister, a popular leader can boost the electoral fortunes of the party. But I think that the LDP has not managed to shake the financial scandals that have been dogging it. They don't really have a vision yet that inspires people. They've been losing a lot of ground to populist parties, et cetera. So I think at least now it would be very risky to do that. And they haven't yet worked out a new coalition strategy for elections either. So that Komeito plank of the coalition was really important in turning out those numbers of seats. So I think that they'll have to balance taking those risks. Now probably the pressure is off because they have this very slim majority in the lower house. And if they can hold on to that, they maybe will just muddle through as long as they can. It'll be difficult, but it is amazing that her support ratings are so high so far.
Thank you, Kristi. Eva, what are you looking out for in 2026?
When it comes to challenges, I was also, first was politics and second was economy, precisely also because what you said, Robert. I mean, the whole popularity rating is really about the personality of Takaichi Sanae herself, not the LDP. And that is really the worrying side. And it's interesting, I mean, when you actually dig a little bit, it does come a little bit from, younger and female voters. So I guess there's a little bit of that element to it too. But that was covered. I mean, I'll personally be looking at the nitty-gritty and the defense and security reforms. The intelligence reforms are crucially needed. I mean, that's really an area that was institutionally and legally too fragmented and was a major domestic weakness for Japan's security defense transformation. So that is really something that needs to be redressed. It will have impact on counterespionage. It will have impact on cybersecurity. What sort of resources will be, how the resources will be divided in the different sectors, what sort of coordination mechanisms may be put in place in some of those new areas. And same for the defense industrial strategies. It's usually part of the three strategic documents. So loosening legislation on arms exports is, of course, something that we've been discussing, well, since Abe, really. Going a little bit more in detail, other than all the other points that have been already mentioned. So defense spending, is the new strategy going to go a step further beyond the 2%, 3.5%? What, any commitment whatsoever? That's a big question. But the domestic front is worrying me. I guess the good news is that Kristi said the next elections are not, unless we are having a snap ones, are still far ahead. Let's hope the current prime minister will navigate through.
I think what you're both saying is how much there's going to be going on in Japan in 2026 on all fronts, economy, politics, and security. And I'm glad, Eva, you mentioned the intelligence reforms, which also look really interesting. Moving now to our final slot on this podcast is the Japan memo questions, which we ask all our guests. We have a lot of fun with this section, and we have some fantastic answers right across from hardcore academia to culture and everything. So very keen to hear both of your thoughts. Two questions are whether you have any book recommendations for listeners who want to understand Japan better and what you think people get wrong about Japan. So, Kristi, can I go to you first, please?
The book question is always very difficult because there are so many fantastic books about so many aspects of Japan. But given what I was saying about the fluid political situation, assuming many listeners are familiar with many aspects of Japanese politics or society, I think there's a series of books called Japan Decides that covers every election. And they just released very recently their volume looking at the 2024 election that looks at defense issues, economics, all kinds of things. So I think for people who are trying to understand what's happening in the news today, you could at least get a baseline from last year, and they do update this with every election. I think it's a good one-stop shop for getting a look at evolving dynamics in Japan and the politics. What people get wrong about Japan. I feel like I've been receiving a lot of questions lately about rising populism in Japan and if this is taking off, particularly in the UK and Europe. I feel like this is a central area of concern, perhaps due to their own dynamics. In the US, of course, with the return of Trump, it's on people's minds. I am very much of the opinion that it's too quick to jump to conclusions with this. I think it's true that the discourse is changing in Japan, and particularly the 2025 upper house election. There was the emergence of Sanseito, which ran on this Japanese first platform that very self-consciously drew on the example of MAGA and Trump in the US. But I think that when you look at the dynamics underlying it and like exit polls from that election, it's pretty clear that Japanese people are mostly frustrated with the economy, inflation, high prices, and things like that. I recall that one exit poll I looked at asking people, what was the top issue you were thinking about when you voted? Only 6% or something like that of people said that they voted on foreigner-related issues, and the vast majority were concerned about inflation, etc. So, of course, economic concerns are also part of populism, but I do think it's too early to say. These gains could be wiped out if things change, if the LDP manages to pivot, etc. These parties might not gain more in the next election. So I think my key takeaway is that it's a fluid situation and that, right now a lot's up for grabs, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Japan is heading for the election of their version of President Trump or their version of Brexit, etc. So I think we have to be a little bit more circumspect and look at the developments as they happen.
I've been going to Japan for quite a long time now. Even I'm surprised by the price rises, which the prices have been so stable for so long. And now, whether it's taxes or the prices of ramen or whatever, I mean, you can see why people, why the inflation is having an unsettling effect on Japan. And Eva, books and what do people get wrong?
So many books, but because I was thinking of security, I'm kind of stuck in that line of thought. And I'd probably go on the recent ones for my Greens line of advantage, since we talk about Abe all the time. So this is the Abe book of recent years, Japan related, but it goes beyond. Andrew Oros's, he started with the Japan security renaissance, which is kind of a basis to understand the new shift of Japanese security. But I even liked his latest on the impact of aging societies on US alliances in the region. So this goes a little bit beyond Japan, but I thought it was really interesting because when we talk about Japan in the security or in the economy, the whole broader societal aspects are fascinating. How the aging society impacts all these is perhaps a little bit undercovered. You always have it kind of at the bottom of the discussions. Yes, and then there is the problem of aging societies. But to go actually into detail of how exactly it affects, including, electoral preferences. Of course, it's not just about recruitments into police, or self-defense forces, but it really has a pervasive effect across societies. I think that's a very interesting angle to look at. And what we get wrong, Kristi's right, the Japan First movement, I think, was especially after the July elections, everyone started to talk about that. And it kind of goes in line with Japan being a closed society. But that was already covered. Another very famous cliche, I guess, is Japan remilitarizing. And the answer is no. And of course, then you start explaining, but the short answer is no, it is all defensive. And usually if you just look at the map, and that's usually enough, frankly, whether you talk to students or to your grandma at the Christmas dinner, you just look at the map, point at Japan, see, this is North Korea, this is Russia, this is China. On the other side is just a big pot of water. And then the US, you realize where all this is coming from. So probably not a big surprise. But on the literature side, I would encourage also to read Japanese literature. I'm a big fan of real fiction.
This will be released just before Christmas, and our listeners may want something joyful to read or something enlightening on literature. Who would you recommend, or who are you reading at the moment?
I'm a big fan of old Japanese writers, Kobo Abe, Kenzaburo Oe. So it's not very joyful, actually.
Not so joyful.
But it's fascinating.
Yes.
The Sandwoman, the
yes.
Boxman and stuff.
The film, The Sandwoman, is a wonderful film. It must be done in the 60s, I think.
I've never seen the film, but the book is fascinating.
A great novel, but not for those seeking something happy and joyful.
No.
Well, thank you so much, Kristi and Eva, for your time and your insights and all the detail you've given us around the very complicated things that are going on in Japan. Absolutely wonderful. And I've certainly learnt a lot from you both as well. To our listeners, please do follow Kristi and Eva on their social media channels, the details of which will be in the show notes to this podcast. And again, to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us on Japan Chair at iiss.org. Japan Chair is all one word. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair program and the IISS on our website. Thank you again, Kristi and Eva, and audience. See you next time. Goodbye.